Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and I'm getting ready to do a series of posts showing you how to make quilts that have triangle blocks in them. This is the first post. It's just going to show you the difference between a half square triangle and a quarter square triangle, which are the two most basic triangles you use when piecing quilts. And it's also going to introduce you to some of the quilting tools that you might use that you don't have for anything else. They're really specifically quilting tools, and they are especially useful for when you need to do very precise quilt making and when you need to cut triangles. So that's what I'm going to show you today. First, I want to show you the difference between a half square and a quarter square triangle, because they're kind of tricky. You can't really tell the difference by just looking at them. So, a half square triangle, they're both cut from squares, obviously, given their names. A half square triangle is when you cut a square in half on the diagonal. So it's got a right angle and two straight sides, and then the longer side is opposite, the hypotenuse is opposite the right angle. A quarter square triangle is when you take a square and you cut it into fourths. And this then is your right angle, and your hypotenuse is across from the right angle, and these two squares these two lines are the same length. So essentially, they look like the same kind of triangle. The difference is in where the grain lines are, and this is really, really important in quilt construction. When you cut a square, the grain lines are on these straight edges. So that's the straight of grain. So on a half square triangle, the straight of grain is on the two short sides, and the long side is the wiggly bias that is really easy to stretch out of shape. On a quarter square triangle, remember your square has the straight of grain on the sides. So on a quarter square triangle, your long edge is the straight of grain, and the wiggly bias edges are your two shorter edges. That's really important when you put a square together for a quilt block. Now I'm going to draw kind of a typical quilt block that would use half square and quarter square triangles in it. This would be a component of a lot of different star blocks. When you make a quilt square, it's really, really important for you to have straight of grain all on the outside edges of your square, just like you do when you cut a square. So this is going to be your grain line, and this is going to be your straight grain. So that means that this is a half square triangle because the grain lines are long here, or on these straight edges. And this one is a quarter square triangle, and this one is a quarter square triangle. So when you're looking at a block, when I give you a quilt pattern, I'm going to tell you whether you need to cut half square triangles or quarter square triangles. The important thing for you to know is if you're looking at a quilt that somebody else made and you want to copy it, if you look at each block, you need to look at the block and look at where the grain lines go and let that tell you which of those triangles are half square triangles and which of them are quarter square triangles, because you could cut this quarter square triangle as a half square triangle. It is also a half a square, but that would make the grain lines all messed up on your quilt, and then you would get a quilt that's all wobbly and wavy and out of shape when you finish it. Don't be misled by the relative sizes of the blocks, where this half square triangle is actually half of the block and the quarter is a quarter of the block. I'm going to show you another block that's a little bit different. This is a really traditional block. It's called a flying geese block. Remember, all that matters is not the relative size of the triangles, it's all about the straight of grain. And you always want to have straight of grain on the outside edges of your block. So in this case, the biggest block, the straight grain you want on that diagonal on the longest side of the triangle. So that's a quarter square triangle. And these smaller blocks in the corner are going to have the straight grain on the shorter sides of the triangles. So those are half square triangles. Remember, when you're looking at a block and trying to figure out how it was put together, it's all about having straight grain on the outside edges of the finished block. So, just so you know what we're talking about when I talk about that in the next 12 quilt blocks that I'm going to show you guys. There's just a couple of tools that you'll need that you might not already have because they're pretty specific to quilting and quilting with triangles. One of them is this funky ruler. You'll need a square ruler with a line, a diagonal line down the middle, and measuring lines as you go out on each side. And I'm going to show you how to use this in the first video I do that shows you how to make a half square triangle. But this is definitely something that you'll need. Mine is a 6.5-inch square, and that is a really, really handy size to have. You can find this at any fabric store or quilt store. It's a really, really basic quilting ruler. This one also has 60-degree lines on it. You don't need that for half square and quarter square triangles, but a lot of them will have that anyway because you'll use that for fancier piecing. The other thing that you'll need is a special foot on your sewing machine. This doesn't cost very much money. I think this one cost me $5 or maybe $8, which is totally worth it. This is a 1/4-inch foot, presser foot. And what it has is this special little blade. It's not really a blade, it's not cutting, but it's a very thin piece of metal, and it is exactly a 1/4 inch from where the needle goes in. I often will use my regular presser foot. This is the regular presser foot on my machine, and I will often use it to approximate a 1/4 inch because the edge of that presser foot is really, really close to a 1/4 inch, but it is not exactly a 1/4 inch, and it's kind of hard to make sure that you get everything exactly lined up with that edge. It is much, much easier to get really, really precise piecing with this flat kind of bladed piece of metal here that comes out from the side. So this is definitely worth getting because once you start getting into slightly fancier piecing in your quilts, you're going to want real precision in your seam allowances, and this will give you exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's worth the expense. Go out and get one, and this is also any fabric store should carry a 1/4 inch foot. There's a lot of universal ones that'll fit just about any machine. So that's it. A quick introduction to the difference between a half square triangle and a 1/4 square triangle. And remember, in any of my patterns, I'm going to tell you what to cut. And most people's patterns, if you're working from a pattern, they'll tell you whether to cut half square triangles or 1/4 square triangles. But it's really valuable for you to know what the difference is and why it's important. And it's especially important for you if you're going to try and copy any quilts that you see, any old quilts or your grandmother's quilt that you want to make another version of. You need to know the difference between those two kind of triangles. The other thing I showed you is the 2 basic tools that you're going to need. These are readily available at any quilt or fabric store. They're not super specialty tools, but you're going to need a square ruler with a diagonal line down the middle of it, and you really, really, really ought to have a 1/4 inch foot for your sewing machine. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.